Hi, Emily. It's so great to see you. And thank you so much for agreeing to be an interview as part of this Oxford Net Zero series. Really glad to have a little bit of your time. And I know you're over on the West Coast. I wanted to set things up actually by asking you the first question was, I wonder if you could sort of introduce yourself to our listeners by sharing a little bit about your own story and how you became involved in climate work. And maybe if you feel so inclined, something about that journey that we wouldn't otherwise see on your bio or on your CV.
Sure, yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this interview. I think it's a great idea. So my name is Emily Kibbe. I'm currently a graduate student at the London School of Economics and Political Science, studying for a degree in gender and policy, which might seem a little left field to environmental policy or climate stuff, but it's not, and I'll explain that later. Um, but my path to climate stuff and Oxford Net Zero in particular started as a visiting student at Oxford. So I was a visiting student at Pembroke College studying for politics, um, and happened to just walk into a climate protest outside of our college one day that was organized by Oxford Climate Justice Campaign, and really believed with what they were saying and what they were asking for, and started organizing with them. And through that, got to meet a lot of great people at Oxford, including some people who are now on the Oxford Net Zero team, and kind of realized that the other political interests that I had, I was studying politics as an undergrad, I was very in tune to many of the political debates, all of them and many of them led back to climate. And that if we couldn't organize on this one issue, which is really many issues intersected into one, that we weren't going to be able to achieve any of our other goals at all. And so really got into that, and really thankful for Oxford to be able to have that space and time to organize there, and took it back to the US where I finished my undergraduate degree and wrote a thesis on environmental action, kind of looking at the psychology behind why people engage with action and the different gendered lives of those. So how feminine personalities, masculine personalities, kind of the way we socialize environmental behaviors along the genders, does or doesn't affect how likely people are to engage and at what levels they can engage, be that on a very small scale community level to the kind of higher political level. And since then, I've been able to work with Oxford Net Zero on a number of projects, kind of spanning from the logistics sides of doing the website, trying to come up with content for all the different research and these great fellows that we have now. And then more recently to some advocacy roles. So working with the UK government on their net zero all-party parliamentary group, as well as with some supply chain leaders, different corporate leaders, all with the goal of how to get to net zero and to think more strategically kind of beyond just the let's make a commitment and hope it works out.
Wow, amazing. I love the serendipity in your story, Emily,
Yes.
that the journey in this moment where you just happened to be in the right place with a group of people, and that really was sort of shaping for your journey. I also am just fascinated by all the different sort of ways you're building connections between different themes and again, how they all come together. I wondered if you could share a little bit about where you go as your source of inspiration or for energy to do this work that you do. Are there any particular places you find yourself going when you need that sort of little extra bit of inspiration or energy?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, most obviously, it's the people that I work with, being able to work with great people at Oxford, as well as just in communities at home and at like prior places, being able to be with people who are equally committed and passionate about this, even if we are also kind of in the thick of it and going through the stress of it or the logistics of it. It's so nice to have a community. But then I would say art is the other big thing that there's been an incredible movement. I mean, there's always been incredible movements in the art world around climate, around social justice, around kind of whatever is going on. And I'm thankful enough to be in a community of artists here at home, and have a lot of friends who are climate organizers and also artists. And so kind of taking inspiration from their work, especially music has been, I have some friends who work for young people who are working in climate action, who also like were trained in singing or they're dancing or something like that, and realizing that those two things don't have to be separate. And so I think that's been a really exciting place that to still stay in the ideas that I'm thinking about, but be able to also express them differently. That has been a big source of inspiration.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm going to come back and ask you about your playlist and sort of some of the music that sort of really you find yourself grooving to. But maybe while you're thinking about your favorite songs here, your story there about art reminded me of a really special quote that actually came from Nigel Topping, who's the COP26 high-level champion. And I remember in a meeting he once said, we must all be guided by the science and moved by the poetry. So I think it's that idea of the duality of science and art coming together is sort of what we need to do to, I think, really move culture and drive the sort of more systemic change. So again, rooted in the science and the data, but how do we harness the real power of art to move people? So I think that's fascinating, and I'd love to hear more about, your work at that particular intersection. But maybe I can just sort of come back to this sort of playlist question. Is there any music you'd recommend to our listeners to tune into?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the classics of the like 60s and 70s of the traditional environmentalists. I'm a big Joni Mitchell fan, especially, California, Big Yellow Taxi Cab, kind of very popular songs that everybody knows. And if you listen a little deeper, you'll hear that they're obviously climate songs. And Aurora, which is, I believe she's a Norwegian artist, has some great like climate inspired songs. The 1975 had a song that had Greta Thunberg in it that was great. So I think that there's a lot, not only is it like the traditional kind of more folksy environmentalist genres that are really picking up this and have always kind of had this style and message in their music, but I think there's a lot of different areas where people are kind of clinging on to this and bringing it to the forefront. So there's music for everyone, I think.
I love it. I feel like there's a whole playlist that we need to create here with
there
your
is,
incredible music recommendations. I've got Joni Mitchell, Pave Paradise, and Put Up a Parking Lot going through my head now. Well, let's shift focus, because I want to hear a little bit more about sort of the research you're involved in, because I think you're doing so many things, as I say, at these different intersections of climate and people related issues, and knowing that you've got this sort of policy background. I wondered if you could just sort of reflect a bit on some of the big questions you find yourself asking right now at the stage where you're at in your journey. What are some of the things that are really on your mind that you're interested in reviewing and exploring more?
Definitely. The biggest question is always how. I think we've definitely solidified why we're doing this, and it's always the how of great. So many, it's been incredible just in the past 2 years to see so many companies and countries and cities commit to net zero, commit to a carbon neutral goal. But the big question is how, and I think often when we're talking, whoever you're talking with, be it a government, corporate entity, or just a person, that's always the question on people's mind, and that hasn't been solidified. So that's definitely at the forefront of every day when I'm talking to people or I'm doing research. And I think that in terms of like other big questions, it's the connection to people. I'm not a natural science background, and adore being surrounded by scientists at Oxford Net Zero because they teach me so much. But I'm a social science person, and I'm a community organizer, so I really do always think about people first. And so when we're having, maybe big scientific questions about net zero and what does it mean for carbon capture and how do we balance out emissions and some of these very important technical questions that have to be solidified out. We can't just kind of say net zero and hope everyone knows what it is. What does that actually look like at a human level? I think kind of a cool conversation had recently with some supply chain leaders and talking about what does it mean to decarbonize a supply chain. Wasn't just, okay, so you set a target, so let's like send an email to all the different people that work with you in your supply chain and tell them they need to decarbonize because that's how we do the different scopes of emissions. And so they need to take responsibility for theirs as well. We're going to help you because we're the head of the supply chain, something like that. Thinking more about, okay, but if your supply chain includes jobs that are in the fossil fuel industry that are being taken away, that are being transitioned out with no viable alternative for people working in that industry, you also have to take responsibility for that. And so it's a responsibility not just to lower your emissions, but to do it in a way that is cognizant of the people that are also in your immediate boundary, but then also, of course, in your communities and the communities that you impact or might impact. And so kind of like just the piecing out at each step of where might this impact someone. And for me, and this is a question that I've been asked before, the question of should we get to net zero quickly or compassionately? Should we get there as fast as we can and just leave people behind and just get there because we know scientifically that we've got to reduce emissions as soon as possible? Or should we do it in a way that keeps people first? For me, those aren't two different things. Those have always been the same thing. And in order to do it right, you have to do it with, communities in mind. So that's kind of the biggest question that I feel like hasn't always been at the forefront of a lot of net zero conversations. And I think we're seeing more of it now.
I love that, actually. And one of my colleagues at B Lab, Kim, who co-chairs the climate task force with me, has a really interesting expression. She talks about how what we cannot do is in the race to zero, we cannot run people over in that race. Like, it is so critical that we keep people and climate justice central to our action that we're taking on climate. So I think you two would actually really enjoy a conversation as well. Next time we'll bring her into this this chat. I wondered if we could go just a little bit deeper on your point here about how, and I wonder if you could share any practices that you've seen applied by business when it comes to this idea of really centering climate work in people.
Yeah, I think part of it starts with at the kind of high level strategy level of a corporate governance is no longer kind of thinking of climate as like a separate department or as just sustainability or just kind of those are the environmental guys, let them do the practices, but instead embedding it into the central ethos of a company because it has to be, because again, it does impact many things, especially the things that we don't think it impacts. It'll impact diversity and inclusion within your company. It impacts your brand marketing, certainly impacts logistics and operations. And that, I think, in that breadth of being able to say, this is something that our company holds core to us, can also then flip from the trap that we've seen of a lot of people internally taking responsibility for emissions and needing to also flip that externally. So what does it mean to model that? So I think part of the beginning step is kind of embedding it in that ethos, and then from there kind of moving away from just the okay, internally let's like recycle and like turn off lights, and thinking more strategically about changing energy supplies, changing retrofits on buildings, committing to different things. And then I think also when it comes to offsets, finding credible offsets and not just going for an offset that hopefully like in the papers or in the media or to other people seems fine, but isn't actually a credible offset. I think an Oxford Net Zero has a great little worksheet on what a credible offset is. And I think that is something that companies that have really stepped up and thought critically about that are succeeding the most in.
Well, terrific. And we'll make sure that we have links to things like the Oxford Principles for offsetting. I'd love to actually ask you to imagine a company or an industry that you would most like to work with. Like if you could choose any individual company or if it's easier to think at an industry level that you'd really like to engage in to drive some of this change, which company or industry would it be and why?
Interesting. Oh God, so many. Off the top of my head, I think I would go agriculture and food systems, just because it's obviously, it's a big emitter and it's essential for us to get to net zero in those places, but it's also a very unique industry. They all are, but agriculture isn't just carbon dioxide emissions. It has a different mix as well. And so I think that there's a lot of space for creativity there. And also it's essential. Food justice is something that, is deeply intersected with climate justice, with environmental justice, with gender justice, with kind of a lot of things. People need to be able to eat at the end of the day. And have friends who work in restaurants and in the farm industry, and they really care a lot about this. A lot of them are nature people to start with, and they're people that already care about their climate. I mean, if you're farming, you're working on land every day, you're incredibly immersed in that ecosystem. But I don't think they're getting enough support when it comes to policy decisions that are being made about green policies. And so I think that that would be a really interesting place to work in, and still be able to have kind of a creative and justice lens when it comes to how do we deliver food to people in a way that's not just like everyone just gets a pack of emergency rations or something like that. So
great answer. Really great answer. Okay, well, I've got a few more questions for you. And one of them now is about imagining the future. So I wondered if you could sort of paint a bit of a picture for me in terms of what you think 2030 is going to look like. Where do you see things sort of going next in relation to the work that you're doing or more broadly?
yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist, so we'll think hopefully here. Hopefully we've passed comprehensive climate policy in all countries or in many countries, particularly the highest emitting countries. And we've done that policy in a way that, as we've talked earlier, that is focused on communities, that isn't kind of a strictly blindsided environmental bill, but really thinks about the other elements. I mean, we all live in climate and we live in community together in spaces. And so I think policy that acknowledges that people exist in spaces and in climate, that climate isn't just some abstract comment, will always succeed more. And so some sort of comprehensive bill that I think not only, sets targets, reduces emissions, sets interim targets to make sure we're getting there sooner than our long-term targets. But then I think has kind of a robust culture change. I think in particular, something I would be really excited about is the idea of a climate core. So in a time of economic recession and when a lot of people are looking for jobs, putting that towards green jobs, putting that towards jobs that are good for people, that give people opportunities, but also are good for our planet, I think is a wonderful idea and would be really excited to see something like that. We see a lot of decarbonization of our transport systems, so more public transit, electric cars. Again, though, doing those in ways that are accessible to people. I love public transit, but also will be the first person to talk about how much I hate insert subway T the tube when it breaks down. So I think making sure that people have access to those and that those are reliable systems is really important. Um, yeah, and I think action is the biggest thing. Is that we've maybe if the 2020s are kind of the or the late 2010s is the era of commitments and oh, I guess we should be thinking about this now. I would love the next decade to be really focused on what are we actually doing, and holding people accountable to that too. I think the kind of time for lip service is done. Um, yeah, and in terms of my work, would love to be a part of that policy process. Am someone who would love to work in government and would like to help make sure that those policies get done and that people aren't left behind in that process. I like the don't run over anyone.
Don't run over anyone in the
On the
race
way
to
to net
zero.
zero. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I like this idea that action is the biggest thing. And that, as you sort of really helpfully said, if the past decade has been about making commitments, this decade that has to be about action and action with accountability associated with it. So that's a really helpful call to action, and hopefully something that will really steer all of our work as we head towards 2030. Okay, so the last question actually has to do with the young people on campus right now. And you obviously, coming back to your story, had a moment, right, where by sort of finding a community of climate activists, sort of serendipitously, have found your journey shaped by that experience. I imagine there's going to be a lot of young people maybe that are coming to Oxford for the first time, or have maybe been in Oxford already for a couple of years, but who are sort of feeling all this and want to engage. What sort of advice would you give them in ways they can become part of this movement, part of Oxford Net Zero, part of what Oxford Net Zero stands for in terms of what its programming is all about?
Yeah, Oxford is so blessed to have such a great climate community and have so many people committed to this, especially the young people, especially undergraduates and young students are really committed to this. And so there's a bunch of groups on campus and also Oxford Net Zero. So Oxford Climate Justice Campaign is a wonderful campaign that works on kind of what we've just said, holding the university accountable, also operates on a college level. So it doesn't have to just be kind of at the university level of Oxford. You can advocate within your college, within JCRs, MCRs. Oxford Climate Society holds incredible talks, and I think has also kind of pushed to not just be about like, let's learn about climate, but also let's do something about climate. And the people there are really great. And often all of those link back to Oxford Net Zero. That's a new program that really did rely on some of the great environmental thinking from our students. It was pulling from them because we knew that there were people who were thinking about this and were committed to this, but didn't necessarily have the tools to do anything. There's usually a power imbalance when you're a student. Oxford Net Zero has had this wonderful opportunity of letting people come on as research associates or research assistants. We've done a couple internship programs through the micro internship system at the Career Service. That has had a bunch of master's students and PhD students come on and be able to just spend a week or two really getting into one sector's pathway to net zero, or this is all the tools that we want to talk about this step in the decarbonization path. Go find them. And so look out for stuff like that. I'm sure we will continue to run the micro internships. And again, I think Oxford Net Zero is trying to build, and the whole point of it is to draw on the interdisciplinary incredible minds of Oxford. And so even if you think that what you study isn't related to climate, it is probably somehow related to climate. And even if what you study isn't what you want to do in climate, there's definitely space for people there. So come join.
Those are incredibly wise words of advice. I particularly like that piece about, recognizing the intersectionality, the interdisciplinary nature of what's going to be needed. And I think your story that you shared on your own journey is just such an exquisite example of where, if you're open to many different paths and you're sort of driven and led by sort of what you feel in your core. And I heard from you so much about quality and justice and sort of focusing on people, to use that as sort of your navigational tools, and to follow that sort of intuition that you feel. So Emily, thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary conversation. You are a total rock star in the Oxford net zero universe, but let's be honest, in the total sort of world that you're operating in. So thank you for everything that you do and for sharing your wonderful reflections.
Thank you so much for having me and for the wonderful opportunity to talk about this. Yeah, I hope people enjoy.